The year was 1930, and the small town of Clearwater, tucked away in the cold woods of northern Canada, was quiet and still. Snow often covered the ground, and the air smelled of burning wood and damp pine. In the heart of the town stood a large brick building known as St. Mary's Industrial School. It was run by nuns and priests and funded by the government. The building had long halls, tall ceilings, and heavy wooden doors that creaked when opened. Inside, Indigenous children sat in rows on hard wooden benches, wearing uniforms that were too stiff and shoes that hurt their feet. These children had been taken from their families, forced to leave their homes and culture in order to learn the ways of the European settlers. Most of them were scared and lonely. They spoke languages that the teachers punished them for using, and they were given new names that were easier to pronounce. Every morning, the children lined up in silence and marched to class. They learned to read, write, and pray. At night, they slept in narrow beds lined up in freezing rooms, whispering stories about their homes and their parents, hoping one day they would be allowed to return. But the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into years. Some children became too sick and never got better. Others ran away into the dark forest, but few ever made it back. Then one winter morning in January, something happened that no one could explain. The entire class of 38 children vanished. There was no warning. The beds were empty, the dining room silent, and the school strangely calm. The nuns said the children had been moved to another school. The priest told people they were sent away for special training. But no one in town saw them leave, and no other school had records of receiving them. That morning, a photo had been taken outside the school. It showed the entire class, standing in rows with serious faces. Behind them was a moving truck labeled S.H. Styles Moving and Storage. No one knew why the truck was there. The company had no record of visiting the school, and no one remembered seeing it drive to the town gates. Within days, any paper records of the students were gone. Their names were crossed off school logs, and even the church books were clean of their entries. When parents from nearby villages came to ask questions, they were told nothing. Letters were ignored, and visitors were turned away. Eventually, the family stopped coming, and the story faded into silence. Years passed. The building continued to operate, but the classroom once used by that group of children remained locked. Some teachers said it was cursed. Others believed the children had simply been sent far away, though no one could prove it. The silence around the event grew so strong that it was as if the children had never existed. No newspaper mentioned them again. The photo of the group disappeared from the front office. People who lived in Clearwater either didn't remember or were too afraid to talk. By 1950, even the oldest teachers had retired or passed away, and no one dared open the locked classroom. New generations of students came and went, but the truth about what happened in 1930 remained buried like a ghost story, whispered by some but never fully believed. Somewhere, deep in a filing cabinet in the basement of the town hall, one yellowed sheet remained. It had the names of the 38 children typed in faded ink, with the words transferred January 15, 1930 written beside each one. But no destination was listed, no signatures, and no follow-up notes. The page had slipped between other documents and was only kept because no one had thought to throw it away. It sat unnoticed for decades, waiting for someone to find it and ask the question again, where did they go? By 1975, Clearwater had changed. The trees were thinner now, and many of the old buildings had been torn down or left to rot. A few people still lived in the town, mostly older folks who remember when the streets were busier and the church bells rang every Sunday. The old St. Mary's School had shut its doors 10 years earlier. Its windows were boarded up, and weeds had grown around the edges. Most people said it was haunted, and children dared each other to sneak in and look around. But one man wasn't there to chase ghost stories. Sheriff Tom Reed, a quiet, thoughtful man in his early 50s, had come to Clearwater to look into old land records. A few new businesses were interested in the area, and the sheriff had been asked to help gather files about empty properties. He walked slowly through the town hall, flipping through old folders, scanning yellow pages, and brushing dust from covers. Then he found the sheet. It was near the bottom of a drawer, between tax reports from 1929 and letters about rail repairs. The paper was fragile, and the ink almost too faded to read. But the title at the top stood out: Student Transfer Log, January 15, 1930. Sheriff Reed read the names slowly, one by one. Most were clearly indigenous, names he recognized from nearby communities. But what caught his attention was that none of the names appeared in any of the following year's documents. No school records, no housing placements, not even burial logs. He flipped through every folder he could find, and still, nothing. It was as if those 38 children had simply vanished. Curious and uneasy, Sheriff Reed decided to pay a visit to the old school building. The front doors were locked with thick chain, but the side entrance had a broken window, likely from kids sneaking in. He stepped through carefully, shining his flashlight into the dusty halls. The air smelled old and damp, and the silence was heavy. Floorboards creaked under his boots. He passed empty classrooms, all stripped of furniture and supplies. Then he reached a door at the end of the hallway. It was different from the others, painted a dull gray and locked with a rusted padlock. Scribbled in chalk on the wood were the words, "Keep out." Sheriff Reed hesitated, then used a crowbar to pry the door open. The lock gave way with a snap, and the door creaked slowly open. Inside was a classroom frozen in time. Desks were still in rows, small jackets hung on hooks, and slates lay on tables as if waiting for students to return. But everything was coated in a thick layer of dust. Reed walked slowly down the rows, running his hand over the wooden desks. Then he saw something strange. In the back corner of the room was a trapdoor, almost hidden under a woven rug. It had no handle, just a small iron loop bolted to the wood. His heart pounding, the sheriff crouched and pulled it open. A cold draft at his face as he peered down into darkness. Using his flashlight, he saw a narrow staircase made of stone leading downward. It didn't make sense. The building had no basement listed in its blueprints. Still, Sheriff Reed began to descend the steps, each one creaking under his weight. The deeper he went, the colder it became. Finally, the steps ended in a narrow hallway. The walls were stone, and the air smelled like mold and something else, something he couldn't quite place. He moved forward slowly, his flashlight beam shaking as his hand trembled. Then he saw the doors. There were two of them, large and made of metal, built into the walls like vaults. One had a small, broken window near the top. He stepped closer and wiped the glass clean. What he saw made his stomach turn. Inside were rows of wooden crates, each labeled with numbers. Some had names. Others simply said unknown. Sheriff Reed stepped back, heart racing, mind filled with questions. Why were there crates hidden under a classroom? What was in them? And could this be connected to the missing children? Sheriff Reed stood still for a long moment, staring at the heavy metal doors. His breath was shaky and his hands were cold, even though he was sweating under his coat. He wasn't sure what he'd just found, but it was clear something had been hidden away for many years. He took a deep breath and walked toward the door with the broken window. It was rusted and stuck, but after a few hard pulls, it creaked open. The smell grew stronger, something like old fabric, damp earth, and something else that made his stomach tighten. He stepped inside, shining his flashlight around. The room was lined with tall wooden crates stacked against the walls. Each one was labeled with dates and numbers. Some were stamped with the same name, S.H. Styles Moving and Storage, the same company name from a photo he had seen earlier in the town hall, the strange truck that had been in the picture with the missing children. He knelt down and opened the lid of the nearest crate. Inside were old clothes, folded neatly, small shoes, sweaters, and even hand-knit scarves, all children's items. He moved to another crate and found more of the same. Small leather-bound notebooks, slates with half-erased chalk writing, toys made of cloth and string. One crate held only blankets and name tags, the kind that used to be pinned to children's uniforms. He picked one up and read the name, Anika Redbird. The name matched one on the faded transfer list he had found earlier. He backed away slowly, his mind racing. These weren't supplies meant for storage. These were belongings, left behind by the missing children. But why were they here? Who packed them away and sealed them underground? Sheriff Reed searched the room further, finding no signs of bodies. But he wasn't comforted. The idea that someone had taken the time to pack each item so carefully made it feel worse, not better. It meant someone had known what they were doing. They weren't hiding garbage. They were hiding history. As he turned to leave, he noticed a small journal half stuck behind one of the crates. He pulled it out gently. The cover was cracked and brittle, but the pages inside were still readable. The handwriting was small and shaky, clearly written by a child. The journal belonged to a girl named Elsie Standing Cloud. Her entries were simple at first. She wrote about the cold rooms, the strict nuns, and how much she missed her mother. But as the pages went on, her writing changed. One entry said, "They say a truck is coming. Sister Agnes says we're going on a trip, but I don't believe her. Why are we packing our things at night?" Another said, "They told us not to talk. If we talk, we won't get to go home. I think some of the big kids know something, but they won't tell us." The last page was scribbled and messy. The truck came. It was loud and smelled like smoke. They took us out one by one. I saw boys crying. "I want to go home. Please, someone help us." Sheriff Reed closed the journal slowly. His throat felt tight, and he was filled with a heavy sadness. He knew then that the children hadn't been transferred. They had been taken, where or by whom, he didn't know yet. But someone had made them disappear, and their stories were left here, buried in the dark. Sheriff Reed made his way back up the stairs and out of the school. The sunlight outside felt wrong, too bright after the shadows he'd just come from. He sat on the steps for a while, trying to collect his thoughts. He needed to report what he had found, but he also knew that some people wouldn't want this truth uncovered. It was easier to forget than to face what had been done. That night, he went back to his office and locked the journal in his desk. He made copies of the student list and wrote a detailed report of everything he had found. But he didn't file it right away. He needed to be sure. He needed to find someone who could help him dig deeper, someone who knew the families, the language, and the pain. Because now, after 45 years, the story of the missing children was starting to rise from the silence, and Sheriff Reed was determined not to let it disappear again. The next morning, Sheriff Reed drove to the nearby Cree Reservation, about 30 miles outside of Clearwater. It was a quiet drive through the forest, with the trees standing like tall shadows beside the road. He had been there a few times before, usually to help with small matters, but this time felt different. He carried the journal with him in a leather folder, along with a faded transfer list and a few of the name tags he had found in the crates. When he arrived, he went straight to the community center, where he asked to speak with Elder Margaret Whitefeather. She was in her late 70s, sharp-eyed, and known for remembering things most people had long forgotten. After hearing what he had found, she sat silently for a long time, staring at the journal he had placed on the table. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but clear. "My sister's name was Elsie," she said. "She was taken when she was 9. We never saw her again." Tears welled in her eyes, but she did not cry. "They told my parents she was sent to a better school, but they never said where. We waited for letters. We never got one." She picked up the journal and ran her fingers across the cover. This is her handwriting. She used to draw stars at the bottom of her letters, like this. She pointed to the edge of the page, where tiny stars had been drawn in pencil. This is hers. She was scared of the dark. Sheriff Reed sat quietly, letting her speak. Other elders began to gather in the room, curious about what was being discussed. He laid out the list of names, and soon people began recognizing them. Brothers, cousins, neighbors, names long whispered about but never confirmed. A hush fell over the group as the reality began to settle. The children had not been forgotten. They had been erased. Deliberately, carefully, as if someone had wanted them to vanish from the world completely. Over the following weeks, Sheriff Reed continued his investigation. With the help of Elder Whitefeather and a few others, he traced the name S.H. Styles Moving and Storage to an old transport company that had shut down in the 1940s. Records were scarce, but one invoice stood out. It showed a large cargo delivery to an unknown government facility, paid for in cash. No names were listed, and the paper was marked confidential. The location of the delivery was never revealed, but the date matched exactly with the day the children vanished. Sheriff then contacted provincial officials, hoping they would open a wider investigation. But most of the people he spoke to were quiet, hesitant, or dismissive. Some even warned him to stop digging. It was clear that there were forces who wanted this history to remain buried, but Sheriff Reed refused. He handed his full report to a trusted journalist named Clara Jensen, who published a story titled The Vanished Children of Clearwater. It spread quickly, drawing national attention. Survivors of other residential schools began to speak up. More hidden basements were found. More stories came to light. Soon, a special inquiry was formed, and teams began searching other abandoned schools across the country. Families finally received confirmation of what they had always feared but never been allowed to prove. The story of the 38 missing Indigenous children from St. Mary's was no longer just a rumor. It was a recognized tragedy. A memorial was built on the school grounds, and a ceremony was held, led by the elders. Songs were sung in the children's native languages. Names were spoken aloud for the first time in decades. As Margaret Whitefeather stood beside the stone plaque that bore her sister's name, she whispered, "You are not forgotten." Sheriff Reed stood beside her, holding the journal that had started it all. He had kept his promise. He had found the truth. And though the pain could never fully be healed, something powerful had begun, a long overdue reckoning, and the beginning of a story that would never be silenced again.